All right, folks, buckle up because today we're exposing the shocking reality of the food shortage crisis FEMA doesn't want you to know about. This isn't just about empty shelves at your local grocery store. This is about strategic stockpiling, government control over food resources, and the long-term implications for your family's food security. FEMA has been quietly preparing for large-scale disasters with extensive food reserves under the guise of emergency management. But here's the kicker. Their stockpiling efforts aren't just a safety net. They're also creating ripple effects that impact what's available for you to buy right now. Rising food prices, supply chain bottlenecks, and resource redirection are already straining food banks and driving millions of Americans closer to food insecurity. The reality is grim. Inflation has driven up the price of basic groceries like eggs and bread, and pandemic-era relief measures have expired, leaving millions with less support. Meanwhile, FEMA's plans suggest they're bracing for a long-term crisis, not just temporary disruptions. What does that mean for you? It means now is the time to take control of your food security. Let's dive into the strategies FEMA uses and what you can do to protect your family before it's too late. FEMA's strategic food stockpiling is a masterclass in preparation, but also a double-edged sword that raises more questions than it answers. On the surface, it seems like a necessary measure, stockpiling massive reserves of food to ensure the nation is ready for catastrophic events. These efforts are part of FEMA's Emergency Food and Shelter Program, designed to safeguard millions of people during natural disasters, economic collapses, or even geopolitical crises. But the process isn't as simple or benign as it seems. While FEMA builds these national reserves, it quietly redirects critical staples like grains, beans, and non-perishable goods away from retail markets and into long-term storage. This has immediate consequences for the public. As more of these essential items disappear into government warehouses, supply chains strain under the pressure, leaving less available for consumers. What's left on grocery store shelves becomes more expensive, feeding into the cycle of rising prices that are already squeezing household budgets across the country. The effects are even more pronounced in areas already struggling with food insecurity. Small grocery stores and food banks, which rely on steady access to affordable staples, are finding it increasingly difficult to stock up. This ripple effect exacerbates existing inequities, making basic goods inaccessible to the most vulnerable populations. FEMA's focus isn't just on any food, it's on items with extended shelf lives like freeze-dried meals, dehydrated foods, and vacuum-sealed grains. These products are critical for emergency scenarios, but are being stockpiled in quantities that leave gaps in the commercial market. Consumers are already noticing limited variety in their options, and some categories like rice and certain beans are becoming prohibitively expensive. The longer these efforts continue, the more likely it is that some products will become outright scarce. This isn't just a short-term trend. FEMA's actions signal that they're preparing for something far larger than the temporary disruptions we're used to. The emphasis on securing food that lasts for years indicates anticipation of a crisis that could span months or even longer. While this strategy ensures long-term preparedness, it raises unsettling questions about what FEMA knows that the public doesn't. Are we heading toward a prolonged disaster, whether economic, environmental, or geopolitical, that the average consumer is completely unprepared for? Adding to the complexity is the lack of transparency around these stockpiling efforts. The public is left in the dark about what's being stored, how much, and where it's going. This uncertainty fuels speculation and mistrust, particularly as people struggle to make sense of the rising costs and shrinking variety of available food. FEMA's stockpiling efforts might be a necessary precaution, but they come at a cost that the average American is already feeling. The strain on food banks across the United States has reached unprecedented levels, creating a humanitarian crisis that often flies under the radar. Food banks are the last line of defense for millions of Americans who are struggling to make ends meet. But what happens when this vital safety net starts to fray under pressure? Unfortunately, that's exactly what's happening as FEMA redirects critical food resources toward its long-term stockpiles, leaving local food banks scrambling to fill the gap. In states like Texas and California, the number of families relying on food banks has nearly doubled since 2019. Inflation has driven up the cost of basic groceries, with items like eggs, milk, and bread becoming luxuries for many. At the same time, pandemic-era relief programs have expired, leaving millions without the additional federal assistance that helped them keep food on the table. The result? Food banks are seeing record demand but are struggling to replenish their shelves. Many food banks rely on donations from local retailers, federal programs like FEMA's Emergency Food and Shelter Program, and community contributions. But with FEMA diverting substantial quantities of food into national reserves, fewer resources are available for local distribution. Staples like grains, beans, and canned goods are becoming harder to source, and food banks are being forced to ration supplies. Some have even had to limit the number of distributions or reduce the amount of food provided per family, leaving many households unable to meet their basic nutritional needs. The issue is particularly severe in areas already grappling with high levels of food insecurity. Rural communities, which often depend heavily on food banks, are feeling the pinch even more acutely. These areas frequently lack the infrastructure and funding needed to handle such high demand, creating a perfect storm of scarcity. The challenges aren't just logistical, they're emotional too. For many families, food banks are the only way to put meals on the table, and the reduced availability of supplies is causing widespread anxiety. Parents are reporting skipping meals to ensure their children can eat, and seniors are being forced to choose between food and medication. This strain on food banks highlights a significant disconnect between FEMA's national preparedness goals and the immediate needs of local communities. While FEMA's efforts are geared toward future emergencies, the present-day consequences are creating a crisis that is just as urgent. Bridging this gap will require a coordinated approach that balances long-term planning with immediate relief, ensuring that no one is left behind in the race to prepare for the unknown. FEMA's approach to food distribution during crises reveals a glaring divide between urban and rural communities. The agency's strategy prioritizes densely populated areas, reasoning that the concentration of people in cities makes them the most vulnerable during emergencies. While this logic might seem sound, it leaves smaller towns and rural regions at a severe disadvantage, exacerbating existing inequalities. Urban areas typically receive the bulk of emergency food supplies, with resources allocated based on population size. This means that rural communities, which are often already underserved, receive significantly fewer resources or face longer delays in getting them. For residents in these areas, access to emergency food can mean traveling hours to distribution points or going without. The challenges for rural areas don't stop there. Limited infrastructure, such as fewer grocery stores and poorly maintained roads, makes it even harder to get food to those who need it. Many rural communities also lack the robust local food assistance programs that urban centers can rely on, leaving them more vulnerable when FEMA's distribution model falls short. Recent weather events have highlighted the stark reality of these disparities. In 2023, severe flooding in parts of the Midwest cut off entire towns from supply chains, leaving residents without access to food for weeks. FEMA's focus on urban areas meant that relief efforts were slow to reach these isolated communities, underscoring the flaws in a one-size-fits-all distribution strategy. Rural communities are also more likely to experience food deserts, where access to fresh and diverse food is limited even in the best of times. When crises hit, these regions face compounding challenges that make recovery even harder. The lack of resources not only affects immediate food security but also weakens long-term resilience, leaving these areas more susceptible to future disruptions. FEMA's targeted distribution plans are a reminder that a centralized approach to disaster relief often overlooks the nuanced needs of different communities. Addressing these gaps will require more than just redirecting resources. It will take a fundamental shift in how emergency preparedness accounts for regional disparities. For now, residents in rural areas must find ways to bolster their own preparedness, as reliance on federal aid may leave them waiting longer than they can afford. The expiration of pandemic-era relief measures has created a seismic shift in food assistance programs, leaving millions of Americans struggling to cope with rising grocery costs. SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which serves as the backbone of federal food aid, underwent temporary expansions during the pandemic that provided a lifeline to low-income families. These expanded benefits helped cushion the impact of inflation, supply chain disruptions, and job losses. But as of 2023, those benefits have been significantly reduced, or in some cases, eliminated altogether. The cuts couldn't come at a worse time. Inflation has driven the cost of groceries to record highs, with staples like eggs, dairy, and grains seeing some of the sharpest increases. Families who were already struggling to stretch their food budgets are now facing an impossible balancing act, forced to decide between buying groceries and paying for rent, utilities, or medical bills. On average, households have lost over $90 per month in SNAP benefits, a reduction that represents multiple meals for a family of 4. Seniors, disabled individuals, and low-income families have been hit particularly hard. For many, SNAP was the difference between having a consistent, albeit modest, food supply and going hungry. The rollback of these benefits has sent shockwaves through food assistance programs across the country. Food banks, already grappling with rising demand, are now being inundated by individuals and families who had previously relied on SNAP to meet their needs. In some regions, the number of people seeking food assistance has doubled in just the past year. The situation is compounded by the fact that SNAP benefits are calculated based on outdated models that don't reflect current grocery costs. Even before the recent cuts, benefits often fell short of covering a full month's worth of food. Now, with prices continuing to rise, the gap between what SNAP provides and what families need is wider than ever. Moreover, the reduction in federal food assistance hasn't been offset by other programs. While some states have attempted to introduce stopgap measures, these efforts are limited in scope and funding. The result is a patchwork system of support that leaves millions falling through the cracks. Food insecurity, already a pervasive issue in the U.S., is now reaching crisis levels, with 1 in 8 households reporting difficulty affording enough food. This silent shift in federal assistance is creating a ripple effect that extends beyond individual households. Communities with high levels of food insecurity are seeing increased demand on local resources, from food banks to healthcare providers. The stress of not having enough to eat leads to long-term physical and mental health issues, further straining already overburdened social services. The rollback of SNAP benefits is a stark reminder of how quickly safety nets can be removed, leaving vulnerable populations to fend for themselves in an increasingly uncertain economic landscape. For individuals, the takeaway is clear: relying solely on government programs is a risky strategy. Building a personal stockpile, learning food preservation techniques, and finding ways to reduce reliance on external support are essential steps to safeguarding your family's food security in the face of shifting policies. In the face of mounting food shortages, rising prices, and reductions in federal assistance, proactive preparedness is no longer optional, it's essential. Building a personal emergency food supply is your first line of defense against uncertainty. And the good news is, it's easier than you might think. By taking a strategic approach to stockpiling and incorporating practical preservation techniques, you can ensure that your family has access to nutritious, long-lasting food during any crisis. Start by focusing on non-perishable staples that are nutrient-dense, affordable, and easy to store. Grains like rice and oats, legumes such as beans and lentils, and canned goods, vegetables, meats, and soups are excellent choices. These items have long shelf lives and provide a solid foundation of carbohydrates, proteins, and vitamins to sustain you during prolonged disruptions. Aim to stockpile at least 3 to 6 months' worth of food, adjusting quantities based on the size of your household. Home food preservation is another powerful tool for extending the usability of fresh produce and perishable items. Canning, for instance, allows you to safely store fruits, vegetables, and even meats for years. Dehydrating is a space-saving method that works well for fruits, vegetables, and herbs, while vacuum sealing can keep items like grains, pasta, and nuts fresh for extended periods by removing oxygen. These techniques not only reduce waste but also increase your self-sufficiency, giving you peace of mind when grocery stores are inaccessible or understocked. Diversifying your stockpile with freeze-dried meals is a smart move for long-term preparedness. These meals, commonly used by preppers and outdoor enthusiasts, require only water to prepare and can last up to 25 years when stored properly. While they're more expensive up front, their longevity and ease of use make them an excellent investment. Water is just as critical as food. FEMA recommends storing at least 1 gallon per person per day for drinking and sanitation, but in long-term scenarios, having a reliable water filtration system is even better. Filters and purification tablets can ensure access to clean water from natural sources, providing an extra layer of security. If you have the space, consider starting a garden. Even a small plot can supplement your food reserves with fresh, nutritious produce. Crops like potatoes, carrots, tomatoes, and leafy greens are relatively easy to grow and provide substantial nutritional value. For those with limited outdoor space, container gardening or vertical gardening systems can yield impressive results with minimal square footage. Don't forget about rotation and maintenance. Regularly check the expiration dates on your stockpile and rotate items to ensure nothing goes to waste. Consuming and replenishing stored goods as part of your regular diet will also help your family adjust to eating these foods if an emergency arises. Preparedness isn't about fear, it's about empowerment. By taking these steps now, you're ensuring that your family has the resources they need to weather any crisis, whether it's a temporary disruption or a long-term emergency. The time to act is now. Don't wait for the next disaster to start preparing. FEMA's stockpiling efforts reveal a bigger picture. The government is bracing for long-term disruptions that could span months or years. While their preparations are necessary, they're also creating ripple effects that impact food availability and affordability for everyday Americans. Don't wait for a crisis to act. By building your own stockpile and taking control of your food security, you can protect your family from shortages, rising prices, and uncertain times. Stay informed, stay prepared, and as always, take care of yourself and those you love.